You're listening to Depth Perception, supported by our patrons on Patreon. Hey listeners, this is going to be a fun one, but first, a spoiler alert. I kind of ruined the ending of Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut in this episode. When you hear us talk about solipsism, know that that's coming. It's brief, but if you're going to read that book, I don't want to be the reason you don't. Here's our show. Hi, I'm Leo.
I'm Randy.
Today we're going to be talking about the simulation argument, or the simulation theory. Best place to start with this is the modern form of this was sort of devised by Nick Bostrom. I'm going to read to you his premise as it's stated on the Wikipedia page, because we need to be sort of on the same page about what exactly the simulation argument is, right? So he says, his premise is, many works of science fiction, as well as some forecasts by serious technologists and futurologists, predict that enormous amounts of computing power will be available in the future. Let us suppose for a moment that these predictions are correct. One thing that later generations might do with their super powerful computers is run detailed simulations of their forebears, or of people like their forebears. Because their computers would be so powerful, they could run a great many such simulations. Suppose that these simulated people are conscious, as they would be if the simulations were sufficiently fine-grained, and if a certain quite widely accepted position in the philosophy of mind is correct. Then it would be the case that the vast majority of minds like ours do not belong to the original race, but rather to people simulated by the advanced descendants of an original race. All right? He concludes from this that, quote, "It is then possible to argue that, if this were the case, we would be rational to think that we are likely among the simulated minds rather than among the original biological ones. Therefore, if we don't think that we are currently living in a computer simulation, we are not entitled to believe that we will have descendants who will run lots of such simulations of their forebears." All right. So that's what he said. And honestly, in that form, parts of it are pretty reasonable, right? For example, like he says, if a certain quite widely accepted position in the philosophy of mind is correct about like what consciousness is, then yeah, like eventually if we could simulate minds with a fine enough grain, they could potentially gain consciousness. Again, we don't know if that's not true. In fact, we do know it's not true, my understanding, in the world of classical computing. We know that a classical computer can't create a reality such as the one we live in, because this classical computer can't simulate quantum effects. But quantum computer maybe can. As far as I can tell, that's sort of the state of it right now. Over the last few decades, this has become kind of a fad theory, and a lot of people just passively believe it. Doesn't help that people like Elon Musk say things like there's a 1 in billions chance that we're in base reality.
We're not, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. He's saying that we're not in base reality. He's saying that we're in a simulation, he thinks. A lot of people misunderstand what it is or are attracted to what they think it is or what they want it to be, and therefore are likely to misunderstand it. And I think because it has the aesthetic of science, it's hard for people to maybe admit that their reasoning might be incomplete. Whereas when we were talking about the Mandela effect, we were talking about people who were attracted to something of the aesthetic of science and science fiction, but who were not really scientists themselves. The thing about this that's different is that a lot of scientists and a lot of people who I think should know better tend to accept very flimsy arguments for it, just on the basis that it, computer is in it.
Yeah, like people that like have a basic understanding of how a computer works, and they seem to think that they can wrap their heads around what it means to live in a simulation. I mean, the most embarrassing thing was that Neil deGrasse Tyson had his mind and his ass simultaneously blown by the idea that the speed of light might only exist as a loading screen.
Yeah, yeah, which brings us to a thing that people who believe in this often do. They'll cherry pick something about the physical world and say, well, since we don't understand why this should be, and since it kind of looks like something that we observe in classical computing, which is some kind of limitation, right? For example, on how quickly a character in maybe in a game, can move, or how quickly something can be run, some tests can be run, um, or just the maximum speed of information on a device, right? Like they'll be like, well, actually, maybe what that's maybe that's what the speed of light is. Like maybe the way that this was all programmed, they put that in there so that we wouldn't go too quickly outside of what can be generated in front of us. Because also, of course, just like in a video game, the world is only generated piecemeal as we need to see it. There's a lot, and that's and that's something that bugs me a lot, right? Like people will go like, oh, the world is probably a simulation, and then to sort of convince you, they'll just give you examples of video games. They'll go like, okay, so imagine that the speed of light is like this, or that the world is like that, just like a video game, and you end up just hearing you end up just being asked to assume that the world is like a video game by being fed a video game metaphor, but not one that actually maps on any known facts. It just fills the space of what we don't know and can't know right now. And it says, well, it might be like this. So what I'm saying is basically that it's completely circular. I'd like to hear somebody try to account for the fact that if we are in a simulation, the entirety of our universe could easily be set such that we are not able to discover it. And wouldn't that be more likely? So if you can't tell, I don't think this is real. Randy, how do you feel about this?
I buy it.
You buy it?
Yeah.
All right, convince me.
I play a lot of video games, so it makes sense. Everybody knows it's bogus. Even the people that say it's true know it's bogus. It it doesn't add up because you can't explain enough things quickly enough to to convince people, right? Because that's like a lot of what happens now is that when you have like a smattering of information thrown at you. I was this close to saying facts, but I'm not going to say facts. But when you have a smattering of information thrown at you, unless you have like an eidetic memory, you're not going to remember everything and be able to like go and look at every individual thing that you were told. And so things start to like fall through the cracks and become, in your mind, like part of your general knowledge of the world. And like, there's probably a time in my life during the 3 or 4 years I spent semi-conscious that like I might have like bought into some elements of this. I mean, I don't think it's like any different than having like a bad understanding of a religion and believing in it. Like, I mean, aside from tradition, like I don't think there's a tradition of simulation theory, but there is like, it does like permeate. I mean, like, why did Elon Musk say that there was like a 1 in a billion chance that it wasn't a simulation?
Yeah.
Like, why did he say that? Was it because people think he's smart, and if he says something that's like against the grain, it stirs the pot? And
I think I know why he said it. I think
because he believes it.
I don't think belief. I think it's kind of like with Donald Trump. I don't think belief is the operative word with him. I think it's because it's profitable for him to push that narrative, because he makes a lot of money on advertising how close he is to X breakthrough, and getting people excited about tech.
It's true.
So I think that's really what it is for him. The closer that is to being possible, like, the more likely it is. Yeah,
in the
exactly.
market, yeah. Yeah, but like, doesn't he seem eccentric enough to believe something is far out, spacey, flower child, like inverted flower child?
I don't think there's any contradiction there. You know what I mean? Like, he's totally eccentric, but he's also like business eccentric. He's
Well, like, I mean, yes, he is like business eccentric, especially considering that he like got his flamethrower idea from Spaceballs and everything. Like, he took his marketing from the Spaceballs movie. But like, I th- I think I think that he's smart enough to know that he can say what he thinks and not what he thinks people want to hear.
the only reason I'm skeptical is because that's true. Maybe that's true in the domain of his personal opinions for sure. But he definitely lies about business related things. Like he's been caught.
Yeah, but I mean, well, I can't say that I have any idea what the context was, but was saying the simulation shit a business thing, or was it just like it's something he believes? And I mean, it certainly wasn't fact based.
I guess what we're really arguing over is whether or not he identifies with his brand. And you know what? Because I feel like what I'm arguing is like, oh, it's his brand, and you're kind of saying, well, oh, it's probably just who he is. I think it's
he
both.
is the brand.
Exactly. Like, yeah, I actually think that we're probably. I think that what we're saying can be reconciled.
Once again, we're saying
or two parts of the same
both,
thing.
Yeah. We're saying both of the things that somebody would say to draw a conclusion. Yeah. Well, Neil deGrasse Tyson, like, to me, is basically the same as Elon Musk. In that he's like smart about the thing that he does, and he's smart in the way that he does it. Except both of them actually managed to ruin their credibility by appearing on the Joe Rogan Experience.
I also think that what people think they do isn't quite what they do, and I think this is more true with Musk.
Well, like,
because Musk
no,
fancies himself as scientist, but he's a businessman. Whereas,
yeah, he's a businessman from apartheid money.
Yeah,
but what they both are is marketers.
Marketers, yeah. On Twitter.
Well, what I mean is that Elon Musk like markets like the X Games science, and Neil deGrasse Tyson has to market astrophysics.
Yeah, and hatred of religion for some reason.
Yeah, which, like, I get why he does it, but it's wrong to put it in Cosmos.
Just seems like he has a personal vendetta. It feels like it feels dirty because it feels like people are giving him money to enact his like.
And I bet it feels like I have a personal vendetta against Neil deGrasse Tyson, and I want it to feel that way because it's true.
Yeah, he's also creepy.
Come on the podcast, coward.
Yeah, come here.
But like, simulation theory is one of those things that like, it's one of the few like fringe theories that doesn't correlate with facts that I'm willing to make an allowance for. Because like, I do make the allowance for like religion that people like think critically about, and like if you've read the Bible and you've read the Quran and the Torah and you've read bunches and bunches of scripture and other holy books, like, and you're thinking critically about it, and you like, you know, you're capable of getting rid of the elements that you don't agree with and keeping the things that you do agree with and everything. Like, if you have a reasoned approach to saying simulation theory is real, I don't see it as necessarily being any different than like any other confident ideology. You know, and it's not the same thing as the Mandela effect. It's not the same thing as being just like a wild conspiracy theorist. Like, I think it's like a philosophy about life, and I think it's like legitimate in that way.
It is different than the Mandela effect. If we're talking about most versions of the Mandela effect, which meaning I think that the Mandela effect sort of attracts people who generally don't know that much about science. But I mean, if you're going to take a very limited view of what the Mandela effect is and say like, well, it's when we have false memories, like, you know.
Yeah, I don't mean to say that like the definition of the Mandela effect is other than what it is. I mean, the belief in the Mandela effect, that it is more like it is the conspiracy theory that CERN destroyed the Earth and is like we're being
Right,
replicated
with
in.
all the misunderstanding of theoretical multiverses and all that.
Yeah, and like I also like when I meant confident ideologies when I said that, like firm belief in the Mandela effect as a conspiracy is the opposite of confident. Like it's all about like defending something that like is completely unreasonable.
Well, a lot of it does, and I mean, I have sympathy for it. Does boil down to people defending their right to like not put trust in you know narratives that have been stamped with official approval. You know, I think that's what a lot of the Mandela effect is. What this is also different in that way though, which is to say that most of the people who believe in the simulation theory in this version that has nothing to do with. I mean, we could talk about the overlap between these two sort of different sort of complexes of conspiracy theories because there is one. But let's just talk about the type of the simulation theory that like
But this isn't
physicists
like.
believe
But
in
is this like a conspiracy theory
or
though?
entertain.
Is this a conspiracy theory?
It's not.
Like fundamentally, I mean, there are obviously going to be people that say it's like
You're right. Okay,
George
so
Soros that runs.
you're right.
He runs the
Right.
supercomputer. But
You're right. It's not a conspiracy theory as such. It's an element of some conspiracy theories, but it itself is not a conspiracy theory.
well, it's also it's like a philosophy.
Yeah. Well.
I mean, it's like a way of saying like, I believe that this is the structure of the universe that I live in.
I guess you're
and
right.
I have to operate within the confines
Right.
of that universe. And
It's right. It's kind of an ontological philosophy. It's about
I
the
don't know what
nature.
that
of,
word means.
It means having to do with the nature of being. Why is it so funny to me, I ask myself, that Neil deGrasse Tyson is sitting there being blown away by somebody explaining to him, that we might be in a simulation? I think it's to do with the fact that he is so like zealously atheist, right? And then he's being presented with something that basically is a prefab model for the universe's existence and its structure. And he's just eating it up, right? He's not saying, well, but could parts of this be metaphorically true or whatever like that, and maybe, no, he's not really like approaching it with wonder, or exploratory curiosity. He's approaching it like with kind of just complete credulousness, actually. Like,
yeah, I mean, he hears something being framed in a way that he hasn't heard it presented before, and it catches him off guard, which, like, to his credit, is something that can happen to anybody.
that's true.
But I mean, he stakes his whole reputation on like being above that kind of thing, I think.
That's the thing. And
That's
it's
why
not just him. It's a
that's
lot.
why it's comical, because like I would be more surprised if that conversation had never happened between like Wayne and Garth. Like I'd be it's one of those things. It's like a Cheech and Chong moment, a total like idiot shower thought that like
Yeah.
literally probably at this point in time, besides like Fauci, probably the most prominent scientist in the world is Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Well, I'm sure that scientists would have a different view, but definitely in the pop culture.
In terms of a name that everybody knows, I don't care what those scientists say. Like, I would tell them they're wrong. Like, I don't think there's a more prominent person in science, as a name, as a face, as a brand, than Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Okay.
I mean, it'd be like, if you were having a conversation with Carl Sagan and you said like the moon has a purpose, and he was like,
well, right. I mean, okay. And here's the thing. you're a scientist today,
Yes.
speculating on the simulation argument. Doesn't it seem a little bit timely? Doesn't it seem like too many of the elements could only have just sprung into existence for this to even, like, shouldn't that
Because
itself be a red flag?
We're gonna circle back and like we're gonna run backwards in time through various iterations of simulation theory, and like every single one of them is more sound and well reasoned than what we're left with today.
Yes, that's
Like it relies too much on things that have come about over the last couple of decades, and like attitudes that have come out in the last couple of decades. It relies too much on that to be credible.
The aesthetics of the simulation argument are literally just the aesthetics of computers, and like the way, like, I mean, there's more than one. It's not the way that we interface with computers, like via screens, video games. It's not the only way to interface with like the underlying stratum of information, right? Like the way that the game is organized in the computer is not. There's not a one-to-one correspondence between that information and the way it's presented to us, right? When we play The Sims, what's actually happening is happening in our own head, in the eyes of the observer, of the person who is running that simulation via an interface. To say that the person in The Sims is experiencing something like what we're experiencing watching them is utterly ridiculous. So if you're willing to admit that, you have to imagine that what you think a human is, what you think you are, is not what the people who are simulating you are. It's utterly alien. Because for you to observe yourself as a human would be like for a sim to observe itself as you're observing it. Do you see what I'm saying? It's not the same thing. What the person who is watching you would observe would be fucking alien to you for this metaphor to even hold up. And that level of that's a creative. We can talk about it creatively. That's what I'm trying to do. But but I don't see it. You know what I mean? Like, it's always a very banal theory, a theory of just like, oh well, it's just a bunch of chained universes. Like, it just doesn't. It just can't work like that. It's fucking boring. And again, I want to get an actually good example from history, but like people used to use metaphors, and I'm just talking about, I guess, people in the history of Western science, right, used to use metaphors for like the celestial bodies that were taken from things in their daily life. How is that any different from this?
It's way more interesting. See, like, you play The Sims, and like, I have a bad habit of getting attached to a sim, or like, and you start to identify with them, like when the meter that says they have to pee starts rising, and like, I have to pee, and this is a person, and as like more and more people begin to associate the idea of things that happen behind a screen with being, they can associate it more and more closely with real life, as like, as things become more graphically realistic, and like, they can stylize it past the point where it's like not creepy. What's the word? The uncanny valley. Like, people, when you're not like confronted with that, it's easy to like identify, and kind of the general attitude like in the world shifts to this idea that like things behind the screen are real, because like you see videos of real things that happen on your phone and on your computer and on your TV all the time, and like I think it becomes easier and easier to like dissociate and say that like you can be behind the screen in some other world. And like I don't think it's any different than like saying that there's an omnipotent God or anything else. Like I think you just begin to associate yourself with things that are not real, because they become harder to distinguish from things that are real. And that's how we end up having this modern notion of the simulation. You close the gap between the real and the unreal.
We're trying to fold the real into the unreal, is what we're doing by saying that we live in a simulation. Which does two things. It makes the real unreal, and it makes the unreal real.
Yeah.
In two ways that again, and I'm so glad you just said that, Randy, because this is a perfect transition into what is consciousness, right?
And who can say? Who can say what is consciousness? We've talked. Oh, wasn't there another episode where we talked about this? It was the last episode.
Yeah, it was the first
Lost episode. Yeah, not the one that I lost, not the one that you lost just recently. That was really good.
Yeah,
At least the one I lost was bad.
thank God.
But like, I do remember us talking about like, who's to say that my speakers aren't conscious just because I can't communicate with them.
Right.
They communicate with me better than I communicate with them. I mean, like, as long as I don't have my headphones in, my speakers say things to me all the time. And like it gets trickier and trickier. Like as we get more things. I mean, the greatest Star Trek episode that was ever created was about like what is conscious. Is Data a conscious person, or is he the property of Starfleet? What was I saying?
You were saying that. You were saying what is consciousness?
Yeah, it just becomes like I can't speak for people who lived at the time of the discovery of fire or something like that. But I have to imagine that they had like the Occam's razor idea about what consciousness is. Like the simplest answer is the best answer.
Right.
And it becomes like, you know, you have more things going on and you're busier and your head is filled with more and more thoughts. And like, we have to concern ourselves with things that people never would have thought about at that time. You know, when they were closer to it, they were closer to like the onset of consciousness than we are. I mean, I'm like 24 years away from, I'm 24 and a half years away from the onset of consciousness at this point, and like thousands of years beyond that, tens and hundreds of thousands of years beyond that, like, you know, I think like the more primordial idea of it is probably a lot closer to the right answer than the convoluted mess that we have to use to like justify doing all the things that we do in a given day that go against our nature and probably what we think is best for us. Like, you know, you have to convolute and say that no, consciousness is like, it's me constantly worrying about what's happening on Twitter and why my podcast isn't getting enough listens. And
yeah, listen to us.
Yeah, seriously, guys, tell all your friends to download it 10 times.
Yes. Please, internet user.
Yeah. But back to the really brilliant thing I just said. Like, I hope it makes sense that we've like strayed from a primordial idea, and like, I'm not saying Occam's razor just because Leo put it in the notes, but because it's like maybe like the truest philosophy that there is. Like,
yeah, I think that first there's
like you have to come up with this like convoluted idea that like a higher being that is basically just like an evolved form of yourself created you to observe how stupid and shitty it was before it became so evolved, and
right.
It liked the right kind of music and like lived in the right kind of society.
Right. The one thing about this that's especially religion like, right, is that it's, and I'm not saying that in a bad way. I'm just saying that there's a level of cognitive dissonance and like lack of.
I think it's a bad
lack
way.
of recognition. What I'm saying is that I'm not shitting on religion when I say this. That's what I mean.
Oh, okay.
So it's a lot of the assumptions that most people who believe in this seem to take up are those that were present in what I think is actually a very arbitrary original version of the simulation argument. The thing that gets me is that even in even in recent iterations of the simulation argument, people will still talk about this reason that Nick Bostrom originally came up with when he came up with the simulation argument for simulating universes to begin with, which is people wanting to go back and see what their ancestors were like. I just think it speaks to the lack of creativity, in this theory. It's sort of this thing that's sort of ready-made for people, and they'll just be like, okay, like, yeah, I believe this is plausible. But really honestly, I don't know what's the goal of this, like having this conversation. If it's anything, it's to push back on people who are just a little bit too willing to believe it when they hear somebody talk about it, or who will argue against you if you say that you don't believe it, even if they don't believe in it. Because the fact is, there's a lot of people like that. And we don't need to be so coy about this. We don't need to be so willing, because there's really not that much there.
Yeah, no, I appreciate arguing for sport, but you have to like argue something that counts.
Yeah. So yeah, I didn't want to I'm glad that I didn't get hung up on that, but I just wanted to bring it up because it's like, why assume that the one reason that the first guy thought up, to simulate universes is even valid? Actually this is
well, it's this thing where, like,
yeah,
when people have, like, enough guts to say something, you're kind of expected to be polite and believe that they mean it and that they're telling you the truth. And I don't know if that's a cultural thing or not, but, like, I mean, how do you think, like how do you think the guy that came up with the hollow earth and concentric rings within the earth, like, he's got a friggin' statue in his hometown? Like, it only happens because people are polite enough to, like, let them speak their piece and assume that they know what they're talking about.
Because he has a statue in his town.
Yeah, it's actually
Wow.
it's not because he was a champion of the hollow earth. It's because they had to have something to, like, claim the land. They had to build something to claim the land, so they built a statue in his grave. But like when people stand up, it's like people like TEDx. People like TEDx, even though anybody can just get up and do anything and say whatever they want. Like,
yeah.
TEDx is a circus compared to TED.
Yeah.
Like, but when somebody has the confidence and the presence and the guts to be up on stage and say something, and they say it, with they're standing straight up, and they've got good posture, and they've got a loud voice and everything, and plenty of people are going to walk away believing them, even if, like, they walked in with, like, an opposite philosophy. Because somebody got the stage, or somebody, like,
or maybe not the people with, like, the
anybody
opposite philosophy, but plenty of people who don't really know what they believe.
Well, no, I mean, people that would walk into a room and say, I'm not going to believe, like,
right.
I'm not going to be convinced about this.
Right.
Like, or, like, there's still like an idea of, and maybe it's a rural thing, maybe it's because I'm from the country and from a small town, but it's like, sometimes I still think, like, wow, that guy made it to a website. He must be serious. Like, this guy, this guy landed on a blog. Like, he means business.
Mm-hmm.
There's a degree of that, and, like, personally, I don't see what is attractive about the simulation hypothesis. If anything, that would make me, like, a nihilist and, like, hate the world. Like, if I knew that I was just, like, on strings and I believed it. Because, like, it's even worse than God in that way. Like, it's way worse than, like...
It is worse than God, because God doesn't call into question our physical reality, usually.
Yeah. Like, I mean, there's the threat that you could be wiped away from reality.
Right.
But, like, there's not the threat that, like...
Yeah.
Like, a guy could spill coffee on the keyboard and delete existence.
That's really funny. Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, do we need to create a theory in which that is a possible world ender? Like, in order to do, like, is there any purpose?
Well, that's like a vision. That's like a vision of a comic strip that I have, and I associate with simulation theory. Is like, the guy in charge that day spills coffee on the keyboard, and he grabs a bundle of paper towels to put it out, but he accidentally hits the delete button, and, like, I'm sure it's a real comic strip somewhere, but it's, like, just the vision I had in my head after doing the reading today. Like, It's one of these things that like only makes life worse if you
Right.
believe in
What
it.
is exactly what does it do for
And what does
science
it do for
to
you?
open up just to open ourselves up and for us to open ourselves up to the possibility of a universe that could be that indifferent? That could be literally like it doesn't tell you anything about who's simulating it. Yeah. It could be a fucking toy company. You know what I mean? Like it could be anything. It could be something objectively horrible. I'm going off of the question that you raised in the notes, which is what does simulation achieve scientifically? The thing about it is it's not a scientific theory, right? Um,
No, but it's explained as science.
it's explained as science, and again with
And
the
that like
aesthetics of
it
science.
implies that scientists are in charge of the thing.
Yes, it
I mean,
implies that
unless
scientists
it is
and
like a Sims game.
software
And
engineers.
I do wanna know, like, did you see anything where somebody said like, this is what I get out of simulation theory, and
I've never,
this is like how the philosophy makes my life better.
I've never seen anybody say anything cool about it. I suspect that it's a couple people who genuinely just wanted to talk about it as a thought experiment, which is I think what Nick Bostrom was after, and then a bunch of people who were just kind of like to think about the sort of infinite nesting of realities for aesthetic reasons. I think that it's an excuse to imagine that there's tons of nesting within this universe, and what we define as the universe and not the universe, as far as I'm concerned, is kind of arbitrary. Back to the thing you said about, or I mean, there's so many, like just go like study ecology. There's so many fascinating examples of nested ecosystems where the one that's within the greater one, it permeates outside of it to some extent. It's not like this mechanical apparatus. The boundaries are fluid, and also like it's different on different levels. It's not the same everywhere. Why do we want that? Why do we desire that? Like, what does that do inside of us to think of the universe as so neat and ordered that it's just the product of the utilitarian needs of scientists in another universe? I'm basically trying to say that there's a lot of nesting, right? There's a lot of nesting within ecosystems, but the lines aren't totally clean. And as far as I'm concerned, there's a lot more like value in that, just to think about as a human, than to try to make the universe into this like sterile, just series of identical nested copies. Why do we want that? Why are we after that? What does it do for people?
Yeah, what I was saying was that like I do believe in like a very indifferent universe, and like you know a universe that doesn't care about us and isn't made for us and everything. But like you said, you get to a certain level of indifference that's just bleak. You know, the if this is like creation but it's fake. If it's creation but it's real, like I can accept that and that's fine. Like I mean, I won't be happy to find out that the truth is like the universe was created just for us, because it seems like a huge waste. But I can probably deal with that. Like if I get to the end of my time in the simulation and I find out that it was just simulation and it was just some like jack off like
If you die in the simulation, there's no reason to think that you are going to find out.
well, yeah, that's another thing. Is like that's
It's
like
totally compatible with the atheist
that's like
bleak idea of what death is.
I was thinking yesterday, and I don't remember if it's something I heard somewhere or something that I thought and I was like really blown away by, and I kept it in my back pocket. But like people always think of like a death generally, unless it happens like in a tragic way, is something that happens like you're surrounded by your family and all these people that understand what's happening and everything. Like death really is the loneliest thing that you can experience, because you'll never meet anybody that can like talk to you about it and talk you through it and everything. And if it, I swear that if my death happens because like somebody somebody was like mistreating my character in the video game, I hope I don't find out, because I'm gonna be livid. Like I relish the idea of like I get to be tree food. at a certain point. I love that. I'll be fine if I go to heaven or any of the other places. Like, if I reach enlightenment or I'm reincarnated or, you know, I take my place as I take my place in the Milky Way as a star. Like, there's a million ends that I'll be satisfied with. But like, if the answer is just that I get like, the guy doesn't take care of the diseases and he doesn't have enough doctors like populating the city, and that's what kills me, and that's how I end, and that's how I never get my answer. Like, I literally.
It's not even going to be a guy. It's just going to be an impersonal software.
It's going to be like you said, like, it's going to be another nest. It's going to be like a simulation ruined this simulation. Like, that's what it's going to be like.
Right.
I just don't understand what you can possibly get as an individual that like has a fervent belief in the simulation. Like, I can't.
I got an argument. I just thought of an argument against the simulation hypothesis.
Is it?
Especially the extreme version, which says that like it's just simulations all the way up.
Yeah.
You know, and that we're somewhere
just
along
like
the
it's
chain.
turtles all the way down.
How could it? I mean, if it's true of us, right? If it's true of us, that we're in like.
Why wouldn't it be true of the people that are running our simulation?
Right. Why wouldn't it be true of the people above us that there's infinite above them? And if being exists in these chains, it would literally be true basically to a virtual infinity, right? You might as well assume that. But if you're going to assume that, you could also assume that at any point somebody in one of those simulations along the chain fucks up. And since that you're arbitrarily far down the chain, wouldn't you think there'd be enough fuck-ups that large parts of the chain are routinely lost?
Yeah, well, that's what a supernova is. Yeah. That's what, or when two galaxies collide, that's what happens. Somebody left the steering wheel. Somebody fell asleep with their keyboard, or their cat is laying on the keyboard. A disaster strikes.
I guess if each universe has infinite the thing is just how do you calculate that? The fact that my point isn't that like there's the math like TM my point is that the math that we have been presented with that's supposed to support this is just as bogus. Like there's just as many holes. It's just as arbitrary.
Early was a tortoise wearing. The spite of the Sierra that fury a little short. Well, she was a successor to infirmary. Some yoder green on drunkle aviary. To a cell short while getting for Bitcoin.
So, what is Thomas Baines?
Beans?
Beans, yeah. What does Beans have to do with this?
Bayes' theorem, right, like, was lost at first when he died. Reverend Thomas Bayes did not publish this, but he had a theorem that was used that you could use to describe the probability of an event based on prior knowledge, taking into account what you thought.
Oh, he actually had like an equation.
Yeah, he did, and you can go to the Wikipedia page to view it.
Oh, I thought it was just. I thought the whole thing was just the idea that like, if you have an idea about certain elements, you can like predict a conclusion. Like,
well, the idea is that you can continuously update that, right? There's like an iterative aspect to it. So like,
I think my understanding of it comes from like that brief sentence that I jotted down in the notes, and that video that explained it as like, you go to the doctor and you're presenting these symptoms, and like, you get these tests done which eliminate these diseases, and so you're left with like, I have this selection of symptoms and this short potential list of diseases, and like, you come out and the doctor tells you like what the most likely one is. Like, you narrow down bits of evidence to the things that are true, you eliminate things that are false, and you try to draw a conclusion. Like, is that not what... I mean, it definitely sounds like that's not what it is, because he has an equation. I never made it past the first paragraph on the Wikipedia page, if I'm being honest.
Well, let me explain to you what I think it is. Okay, so when you have information about something, right, and you base you make a guess about what's going to happen. But you're taking into account the probability of your prior knowledge, and the result is a new probability.
Say that again, but use different words and say that again.
It's a way of saying, how do we control for possible influence, things that would throw off our knowledge based on this test? What's influencing this test? What's the probability? It's a way of actually taking into account guessing how much you think this factor is influencing your test, and then adjusting the probability that you got from the test as a result. That's what Bayes' theorem is. Right? So it's a way of finding probability when we know certain other probabilities, right? So it's like, how often does A happen given that B happens, right? When we know how often B happens given that A happens, and how likely A is on its own and how likely B is on its own. I'm reading from mathisfun.com. There's limits to this, right? The limit is how much information you actually have. Sometimes you're just guessing, right? You're not necessarily able to come up with good numbers to plug into Bayes' theorem to begin with, right? And in those cases, it's less useful, especially if you have two things that you don't know the probability of at all, and you're trying to figure out which of them is more likely. You can't really say that the likelihood is 50-50 that those two things will happen, for example, right? It's just that you don't know. Bostrom came up with a trilemma to describe what he thought the situation was with the simulation theory, right? He thought that it was either that humans would not make it long enough to develop a simulation for whatever reason, right? Whether it's impossible to, or humans just go extinct before they can. Or perhaps humans would get to the point where they could, but as a species would have no need to, or decide not to for whatever reason, and wouldn't. The third possibility was that humans would at some point be able to develop a simulation, and would. He was saying that if the third is true, right, then it's likely that we are not the only one. It's likely that we're not the base reality, because
if it's possible, then it happened.
Right, if it's possible, then it happened, because basically what he's saying is that if it's possible in our reality to do that, we should not assume that it wasn't possible in some other reality.
Well, to me, it kind of reads like the same thing as when you say that if you put the monkeys in the room and give them typewriters, that they'll come up with Shakespeare. It's like, if you live in a universe of infinite possibilities, then every possibility has happened.
Actually, Nick Bostrom's original formulation was better than the one in the Scientific
American I thought it was Kipping
article
that had the trilemma, or whatever his name is. Kipper.
Kipping is the one who introduced Bayes' theorem and tried to collapse the trilemma into a dilemma. Bostrom is the one who came up with the trilemma.
Okay.
Bostrom said, either one, the fraction of human-level civilizations that reach a post-human stage is very close to zero. 2, the fraction of post-human civilizations that are interested in running simulations of their evolutionary history or variants thereof is very close to zero. Or 3, the fraction of all people with our kind of experiences that are living in a simulation is very close to 1. That's what he thinks. He thinks it's one of those 3.
Okay.
He basically says that if a civilization like ours can get to the point where we have enormous computing power and are able to simulate a universe, and we do, and that universe contains conscious entities, especially if it's true that those inside of our simulated universe can simulate a universe of their own, there's no reason to think that we are not also in a simulated universe. Problem really arises when somebody like Kipping tries to take this a step farther. What Kipping does, and you can find this in the Scientific American article entitled "Do We Live in a Simulation? Chances Are About 50-50," which is not a good title. um, to get a better handle on Bostrom's simulation argument, Kipping decided to resort to Bayesian reasoning. This type of analysis uses Bayes' theorem, named after Thomas Bayes, an 18th century English statistician and minister. Bayesian analysis allows one to calculate the odds of something happening, called the posterior probability, by first making assumptions about the thing being analyzed, assigning it a prior probability. Kipping began by turning the trilemma into a dilemma. He collapsed the propositions 1 and 2 into a single statement, because in both cases the final outcome is that there are no simulations. Thus the dilemma puts a physical hypothesis, there are no simulations, against the simulation hypothesis. There is a base reality and there are simulations too. You just assign a prior probability to each of those models, Kipping says. We just assume the principle of indifference, which is the default assumption when you don't have any data or leanings either way. So basically, because you don't know, he's contrived them into two possibilities, right? One in which it doesn't happen and one in which it does, and then assigned via the principle of indifference, assigned the same probability to each possibility. Therefore, he says 50-50, roughly. Or slightly, like it's slightly more probable that we don't live in a simulation because the probability is close to 1, in one of the two possibilities. That's it. So he's literally just, I think, in bad faith, honestly, collapsing these two things together. And here's why. Because he had two scenarios that were very specific in which humans do not simulate a universe, giving rise to conscious entities, right? He has a situation where humans can't get there, they die out. And he had this situation where they don't want to. And then he takes basically what amounts to all other possibilities for human development in which they develop enough computing power and technology in order to be able to do it, and in which it's possible. And he's playing these two very specific situations against all possible situations where it is possible. This is what I mean when I say it's circular, it's a little bit intellectually dishonest, I think, just in order to make like a flashy point. People like Kipping come up with very arbitrary, conflicting possibilities, right? And then they say, they're both 50-50. I just wanted to point out how silly it is that Scientific American would publish a headline, any possibility that you can contrive and then add probability to, when it's something so vague as the simulation, is always going to be kind of intellectually just sort of it's not going to be a good argument because there's so many variables here, and we're just sort of letting ourselves be guided intuitively by what we think of a simulation as being. We think of video games, we think of computer programs, algorithms, right? The point that Anderson wants to make is, okay, this guy figured out a way to make it 50-50, great. Like, anyone can do anything. Anyone can say anything, it's just not worth talking about in terms of probability. It's a cool idea, in the same way that solipsism is a cool idea. Maybe I'm the only brain that exists. I'm the only one who experiences anything. It's unfalsifiable. It has certain aesthetic elements to it baked in, that I would say is, I guess, just sort of the Cartesian view of the world where, Descartes goes through solipsism philosophically. But just like anybody who's, thought about solipsism will tell you, like, eventually you just kind of got to move on from it because you're going to run up against the same wall of, like, what does it matter, right? Like, what does it matter if that's the case? What does it matter if we live in a simulation? If you do live in a simulation, you're not going to be able to perceive it in any way.
Well, like, solipsism is different because, like, if you're a solipsist and you believe that you're the only perspective that there is, like, you're going to have a negative impact on people. Like, the simulation, at least, is relatively harmless.
Well, I disagree. I think that the solipsist can conclude, well, this doesn't matter. I mean, this view might be true. Kurt Vonnegut makes the argument against this in the book Breakfast of Champions, where he has a guy go into a solipsistic mania at the end and, like, start trying to kill people or something.
I don't know if you misunderstand what I said, or if I misunderstand what I said, but, like, if you're a solipsist and you believe that you're the only person with a perspective, like, then that gives you, like, a license to be however you want to be to people, and eventually like it's gonna hurt people, it's gonna help people, but like there's consequences to it. I think really believing in the simulation is inconsequential.
Oh, because it takes the sort of the experiencer and puts it outside of all of us, not in one of our brains.
Well, because you can't use it being a simulation as an excuse to be an asshole.
Yeah, because everybody's on equal footing. It doesn't privilege the one person within the observable universe. Yeah.
Dear society, can you hear the rumblings of a new religion, the return of a fear? The relentless adherence, the expensive experience, the priestess is punishing the patchwork. But heaven's fears of the world, the dungeons and dragons of forsaken the star-shiner's task. You stop telling me to ask you so many questions.
So a lot of you probably already know what the Allegory of the Cave is. This is the earliest example of something sort of similar to this that we could find, or one of the earliest examples.
The idea is that it's like there's prisoners that are kept in a cave, right? I think they're prisoners.
Yeah.
And they kind of like have to like form an idea of what's happening in the world around them based on what the shadows that play against the wall are doing.
Right, and the shadows are being controlled by some order of, I don't know, priests or something like that behind them, who are around a fire making puppets on the wall. So their reality is already like the imprint of a controlled reality. So they're a few layers removed from any understanding of anything outside of the wall that they're looking at, let alone also the cave itself. What would it be like if you left the cave, and you saw the means by which your reality had been produced, and then also saw that behind that means like was the exit to the cave, and you went outside of the cave and saw the world that those priests or whatever had been able to access freely this entire time.
It's like it's the kind of like really like psychedelic existential thinking that like I just scolded people earlier in the episode for not being willing to attribute to people that lived a long time ago. It's just, but the fact remains that it's like it's something that's so like kind of out there and spacey, and I wouldn't associate it with, who was it, Plato? Just like the kind of cool thing that like you kind of would not normally associate with the way people thought a long time ago, mostly because you have no idea how people thought a long time ago, but it was exactly the same. They just made reference to different things and had different cultural touchstones. Yeah, it's really cool and psychedelic. It's like I didn't read far enough to get to the fact that people were manipulating the shadows. I thought they were just like telling the story about what was happening based on shadows because they couldn't hear and get context.
Yeah, the extreme version of it is that that the shadows are actually like a total separate layer in between, and I think that's because he was trying to add to it all of these like metaphors and stuff like that. So like it was also like a metaphorical scheme for like different types of ideas and concepts. Like each layer represented. I don't get that really. I don't know.
Well, yeah, I mean like there's a lot of ways to read it, like with that in mind, like upper classes controlling people and things like that. I mean, there's a lot of ways that you can read it, but like when you read it as like just a piece of like existentialist philosophy, it's really cool and exciting. And I don't know, it's refreshing because like a lot of that stuff is really dry and kind of not the kind of thing that you can be like really invested in as a reader.
Yeah.
But like every now and then something comes along. And something else that is exactly like this is the butterfly dream. Somebody has a dream and awakes from the dream, and is unsure whether they are a butterfly that is currently dreaming of being a man or a man that dreams of being a butterfly.
Yes. Again, vastly more interesting than the simulation theory.
Yeah.
Just a computer nightmare.
I don't think it like necessarily is related. Now that I think about it, it's not really got anything to do with simulation theory.
No, but let's end on that. Why do these things remind us of the simulation theory, and why do we like them better?
I'm like saying it just then and saying what it was. It literally doesn't. It does not to me.
Well, what did he talk about? The transformation of things. Like, how do you get from the butterfly to the man? How do you get from one level of the simulation to another? Like,
So like Inception.
right? But well, I mean, yeah. But I mean, isn't this just Inception? That's the other thing about the simulation argument. Isn't it just popular because
I've never seen that movie, but
it's a nested reality, right? Like, but we don't. The cool thing about the butterfly and the man is we don't know which reality is we don't know if there's one nested inside the other. They might just be parallel and connected. Like, it's totally ambiguous, you know. In the Allegory of the Cave, it's not ambiguous. One reality is very much nested inside of another one. And in fact, this is a lot more like what I think the simulation argument would have to actually be if it were to really hold water, which is that if you can say that something inside of a computer can be conscious, you shouldn't make any assumptions about it being of like kind to the things that created it. Like, that person's experience has nothing to do with the human experience. Sitting in a cave and staring at a wall and watching shadows, like, they don't think, like, if they were to go outside, they wouldn't go, oh, it's just like what I was doing down there, but up here. They would be like, these are space beings. Like, again, like, we shouldn't play The Sims or whatever and conclude that the experience that we're having when we play The Sims is somehow reflective of or hinting at some kind of possible future in which people can literally lead lives inside of computers could somehow be brought out of that, and then go and look up above them or whatever at the people who are simulating their reality and identify with them enough to even be able to conceive of what it is that their relationship is. Like, and I think even the Allegory of the Cave maybe doesn't do this. The Butterfly Dream does it better. You've already gone too far if you can say what the nature of the relationship is. If you can even speculate on it, right? Who am I to these people who are simulating me? You wouldn't even be able to have that kind of a thought. It's kind of like what I mean when I say that if there's something out there that does know that we're here, there's no reason to even assume that it considers itself to be what we would think of as life. You see what I'm saying? Like,
or considers us to be
yeah.
life. That it considers us to be life.
Right? Like, if it's really as powerful as we sometimes fear it might be, why should it consider like us to be anything more than we consider minerals to be?
Yeah.
You know, and the Butterfly Dream is cool because it's totally ambiguous. There's no the nature of the relationship between the butterfly and the person, you know, who's dreaming who. It's inherently like a question.
Yeah, the guy accidentally smoked weed and never recovered. Story is old as time. I still don't like. It still like is not super closely associated with the Butterfly Dream or with the simulation for me, or at least not in the same way that I can draw parallels between the Allegory of the Cave and the simulation. Like, it's a little bit more abstract and like.
Well, you're right. It's not. It's definitely different. That ambiguity about what the Butterfly Dream is, like, as a feature, you know, is what makes it a more enticing and interesting starting point for like interrogating sort of the ontological fabric of the universe. The simulation theory imposes a hierarchy right off the bat. That's what it has in common with the Allegory of the Cave, right? But the Butterfly Dream, it's like just this sort of whimsical, like, who knows? Like, who knows if there's other things connected to this that are completely alien to us, like other ways of being in this universe or being near it, you know, or transferring information to and from it. Who's to say that there's a one-way transfer or anything?
Well, yeah, and who's to say that like both parts of the Butterfly Dream are not true?
Right, they could both be true.
Yeah.
Right. This assumption of hierarchy is just another hallmark of like our very limited, I think,
Yeah.
imaginative
What I-
capacity.
What I think the butterfly dream does better, that like maybe is the thing that makes me not associate it with the simulation theory, is that like it provides like a better question about reality.
Right,
You know,
exactly, right.
Like the allegory of the cave, right, is like it tracks like pretty much 1-to-1 with simulation theory. Like they're basically the same thing, except they use relevant contemporary metaphors.
I would also like just say that they're like both sort of Western cultural sort of fear dreams also about hierarchy.
But the butterfly dream is, it's like pretty Lovecraftian, and by pretty I mean like aesthetically pretty. Like it's nice. Like it like says like, you know, if you've ever read like his dream cycle, that like, you know, things happen in the waking world and that's all well and good, but like life starts in dreams. And it's like a nice thing that there's like another reality, and that cats like dream of being on the moon, and they have a whole reality that is only theirs. And like, yeah, that's the same. It's like the same thing as the butterfly. Like, you know, the butterfly like dreams that it's a man that exists and like, you know, operates in different ways and has its own ambitions. But the butterfly also has like its own motivations. Whereas like in the simulation theory, like the only motivations that matter are the motivations of the people running the simulation, or the beings that run the simulation. I shouldn't call them
Right.
people.
Right. It's
'Cause
like less.
I don't want to give anybody enough like rope to hang the idea that it's human beings that run that.
as dramatic as both the allegory of the cave and the simulation theory are, they're kind of less provocative to me than just simply asking you to imagine what would it be like, what would it mean for a butterfly to dream of a man. Like, holy shit.
And think about what it would mean if you were like, I really am not sure if I'm a man that dreams of being a butterfly, or if I'm a butterfly that dreams of being a man. Like I can't decide.
It's this weird thing where it's a little bit absurd to imagine, to suddenly be surprised by the notion that like, oh my god, like I've experienced the world as a butterfly for a moment. And then to then be unsure opens up the possibility of even being able to wonder like what an insect would have any business dreaming of being a man for. Like implications of that are at least as startling to me.
What was that powder that I kept sticking my finger in the bag and eating? And
4-ACO-DMT.
yeah. There was like a couple of weeks when I thought I was stuck that way after I had like used it one time. It was really a couple of weeks where I was like having an out of body experience the whole time.
Wow.
And or you know, I was perceiving it. I'm sure I wasn't actually not in my body. But actually I'm 100% sure I was literally at the time in my body. I don't think there's any room for debate. But for a couple of weeks, like I perceived myself as like, this is the way it is now, and I'm stuck this way, and I have to adjust to a world where I am 6 inches away from where I
Oh my god.
like I'm not quite where I think I am at any given time, and things are not quite what they appear to be at any given time, and like I have to adjust to this, and I have to settle into that, and maybe that's what happened and I'm used to it now. You know, but that's like why the butterfly dream is evocative to me. It's like I woke up one time after I did that awful rotten drug that was mailed to me, and you know, I couldn't really be certain about what I was experiencing. And like, you know, I just settled into a new way of life for a little while, or maybe since, and I don't know. And like, I don't know, that's the thing that's like so appealing about the butterfly dream, is like it makes me feel a little bit more okay with like, because like sometimes I really like dread the notion that like maybe I never got better from that. Maybe I just acquiesced. You know, maybe I let it pass over me and pass through me, and it's the way things are, and I'm living like that now. And you know, I don't know if I've ever described the feeling, but it really was an out of body experience, in that like there was one of me like a couple inches to the side.
Which side?
I don't remember which side.
That's so bizarre.
I feel like because I'm right-handed, I was perceiving as like my right hand is the middle of my body.
Whoa. That's nuts.
And I'm telling the truth when I say that it went on for a couple of weeks before I either got over it or I made an adjustment. I don't know. Like and the butterfly thing makes me say, like, I don't know which thing happened.
Right. Maybe that butterfly just woke up as a man and said, well, shit, gotta live the rest of my life as a man.
I'm stuck. Well, it's like the three little kids in the trench coat, right? Except they get, like, fused that way. They get stuck there.
Just to remind you, we're in the universe that butterfly woke up in. Like, that to me makes more sense than that there's humans that simulated a world that we're living in right now.
Thank you for listening to Depth Perception. You can support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel, kicking us a little bit of scratch on Patreon.